Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Saturday, everybody. I trust you're having a restful weekend. We begin today's episode with PRC solar manufacturing, which is exacerbating the wider trade frictions with the EU, the US, and others. US-based Politico reports this week that EU solar manufacturers have warned officials that they face an existential crisis with respect to China's near-total dominance over global supply lines, which has caused a supply glut of dirt-cheap solar panels inside the bloc and left them unable to compete. In the coming week, companies are set to begin laying off roughly 4,000 skilled workers in the sector. But in a private meeting between the Solar Energy and the European Commission on Tuesday, Politico reports, the bloc's competition officials said that they will not change subsidy rules to support the industry without a strong push from the EU governments. Meanwhile, a flood of Chinese-produced solar panels is driving prices to record lows in the United States. UK-based The Financial Times explains that this is a boon for renewable energy developers, but a threat to solar manufacturers, trying to create a domestic supply chain for the country's fastest-growing source of electricity generation. China, the outlet writes this week, is the dominant solar equipment supplier. It doubled production capacity last year to more than 1 trillion watts, and now produces nearly 3 times more panels than global demand, according to the International Energy Agency and Wood Mackenzie. Global prices for panels have fallen 50% in the past year, to as low as 10 cents a watt. Quote, "The supply glut has enticed US power companies to favor imports over more expensive domestic panels as they build new solar generating complexes. In response, North American manufacturers say they are pulling back on expansion plans despite lucrative incentives available under the Inflation Reduction Act." End quote. Solar manufacturing, along with EVs and other products, are all part of a wider backlash to a glut of Chinese exports fueled by state subsidies. China already produces a third of the world's manufactured goods, more than the United States, Germany, Japan, and South Korea combined. How does China's industrial policy help exports? Analysts generally cite 3 critical factors. 1. State banks give loans to factories at low interest rates. 2. Cities transfer public land for factory construction at little or no cost. And 3. State electricity grids keep prices low for manufacturers. According to China's central bank, new lending for industry soared to $670 billion last year from $83 billion in 2019. Net lending for real estate, on the other hand, was $800 billion in 2019, and this has shrunk to $75 billion as of last year. So we can see that the 2 directions of this state subsidy support have completely switched. It is no coincidence that as the housing crisis kicked in, policymakers shifted from pouring capital into housing to pouring into manufacturing. This all gives manufacturers a huge advantage over international peers. However, this industrial policy is achieved through a transfer from households to producers, meaning weak domestic demand, necessitating exports more, and thus further exacerbating trade disparities with major trade partners and the resulting political tensions. The European Union announced last week that it is preparing to charge tariffs on all electric cars arriving from China. The European Union said that it had found, quote, "substantial evidence," end quote, that Chinese government agencies have been illegally subsidizing these exports. Beijing denies this. The EU is also considering import restrictions on wind turbines and maybe even solar panels. But like we discussed above, the latter will require a greater push from EU countries. The US is concerned too. The Biden administration has kept in place many of the trade restrictions placed on China from the Trump White House era. US-based The New York Times writes this week that Catherine Tai, the United States trade representative, warned last week in comments at the Brookings Institute that the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was up for review in the summer of 2026. She hinted that the United States might insist on tightening rules of origin of components, notably for cars. Ms. Tai expressed, quote, "China already is a really important element of tension and concern in North American trade relations," end quote. Regular viewers will know why. Chinese components go in increasing volumes to countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico, so that they do not count as made in China and then can be shipped to the US and the EU at much lower tariff levels. According to a recent report from economists at the Council on Foreign Relations, China's surpluses in manufacturing goods are now roughly twice as big relative to the global economy as the biggest surpluses achieved by Japan during the 1980s or Germany right before the global financial crisis. As the New York Times writes, quote, "Deficits with Japan and Germany were long tolerated because they are American allies." End quote. China, of course, is not. Next up, communist capitalism. If you're enjoying today's episode, I have a huge favor to ask. That is just 2 clicks of the mouse, liking and subscribing. This is the only way in which the channel can grow on YouTube. So if you like this content and you think more people should be exposed to it, liking and subscribing is a big help. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for viewers who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely primarily on your support to keep going. Thank you so much, everybody, as always, for the ongoing support. Next up, this week, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times wrote a widely shared opinion piece called "The Future of Communist Capitalism in China. The question of whether Xi'ism is killing Dengism is growing." The piece is very interesting and has sparked debate in China financial circles. For the second part of this video, I wanted to examine selected excerpts from Wolf's piece, then look at one thoughtful response from outlet China Digital by Roger Kremers. Let's first look at the Wolf piece. Is Xi'ism killing Dengism? A number of informed people I met in China last week were extremely gloomy, especially about prospects for the private sector. But will such problems ultimately be solved or not? Much light on this issue is shed by China's Worldview, a recently published book by David Dalquay Li, a distinguished Harvard-trained professor of economics who teaches at Tsinghua University. Perhaps its most startling observation is that from the year 980 until 1840, the beginning of China's modern history, income per head declined. Only after Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up did this change. By freeing the private economy, relying on market forces, and opening up to the world economy, Deng created the conditions for an extraordinary transformation. Yet by repressing demands for democracy in Tiananmen Square in 1989, he also reinforced Communist Party control. He intervened in a new political economy. Today's China is the result. But is it also sustainable? Li's book answers a clear yes to this question. In essence, he argues that China's political system should be viewed not as Soviet, but as a modernized form of the traditional Chinese imperial state. The state is paternal. Its job is to provide stability and prosperity. But in doing so, it does not try to run everything from the center. That would be crazy in so vast a country. It decentralizes to local levels. The Communist Party should, he argues, be seen fundamentally as the national party of China. From this perspective, the Xi regime does not represent an abandonment of the goals of the Deng era, but rather an attempt to remedy some of the problems created by its reliance on go-go capitalism, namely pervasive corruption, soaring inequality, and environmental damage. Above all, argues Li, economic development remains a fundamental goal. It is just that there are others now too, notably strengthening party control, social welfare, cultural development, and protecting the environment. The Deng era did indeed bequeath many challenges. Some of the blame for this lay on the relative passivity of the Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao era. Yet Xi's tendency to centralize decision-making has not obviously improved matters. It risks creating paralysis or overreaction. Failure to shift fast enough from reliance on real estate is an example of the former. Failure to relax COVID lockdowns in time is an example of the latter. Management of a politically driven economy with multiple goals is just more difficult than of one with the single goal of growth. Xi's assertive politics have also worsened relations with Western policymakers. When considering the prospects for China, one should not focus mainly on the list of obvious problems: falling property prices, excessive debt, excess savings, an aging population, and Western hostility. All of these can be dealt with by a country with China's human resources and growth potential, even if with difficulty. The bigger issue is whether, in the centralizing, cautious, and conservative era of Xi, Deng's move from stagnation to explosive growth is doomed to reverse back into stagnation. If people come to believe that the dynamism of the recent past has been lost for good, then there is a risk of a downward spiral of disappointed hopes. But the force of 1.4 billion people wanting a better life is extremely powerful. Will anything be allowed to halt it? The answer, I suspect, is still no. Here ends our direct quote of the selected parts of Wolf's opinion piece. Let's end with observations made yesterday by China Digital. Quote, I'd say Xi'ism is supposed to kill Dengism. In Western political thought, we tend to think about social systems in a static matter. We commit to liberal democracy or the free market, which in essence is the collection of institutions, rules and procedures that we believe will generate legitimate outcomes. Once those systems are in place, they can keep running ad infinitum. The CCP, in contrast, believes that governance tasks change over time, as a society's level of development changes. In the same way that a 10-year-old should live differently from a 40-year-old, they'd say, a 500 GDP per capita economy has different needs from a $12,500 one. The primary challenge Deng identified was poverty. The response, China needs to grow GDP. Deng's policies were thus aimed at growth at all costs, and these costs were high, even if growth was spectacular. Xi, in 2017, formally redefined the primary challenge to be imbalance. In this view, China had, by and large, beaten the worst of poverty and had arrived in a new era, characterized by new circumstances that require a different response, not solely aimed at quantitative growth, but a better quality of life. Xi's diagnosis of better life is, however, not only defined by stuff directly measurable in GDP. It includes better education and social services, more advanced cities, and less pollution. When we discuss growth versus stagnation in China, this diagnosis must be taken into account, if only to evaluate the extent to which the system is succeeding on its own terms. Another element of Xi's diagnosis is that not all GDP is created equal. There is good GDP and bad GDP. GDP from manufacturing or advanced intellectual property, good GDP. It adds demonstrable value to China's economy. GDP from financial derivatives, speculation, or real estate, bad GDP. It extracts social value. Platform economy, not too bad, but shouldn't abuse dominant position. Obviously, there is no guarantee that Xi's term and their eventual successors will act competently to deliver this new agenda, but in evaluating their actions, the benchmark can no longer be only whether they achieve sustained GDP growth. That is simply no longer their goal. End quote. These are fair points, but one might also add that while top policymakers have indeed spoken of the importance of achieving good GDP over bad GDP, for years they have had great difficulty in weaning the country off the latter. What are your thoughts on the Wolf piece and the other observations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a great Saturday, have a lovely and restful weekend, and I will see you all back for more China Update next week on Monday.